Hey folks, welcome back. My name is Cyrus Davis, and today I have my first deck profile of the Prismatic Evolutions format for you. I released a Prismatic Evolutions tier list very recently, where I had Gardevoir EX and Snorlax Stall as my only two S tier decks, and I mentioned that my Snorlax list is built to be favorable into the big three, the three most popular decks in the format: Dragapult Dusknoir, Gardevoir EX, and Lugia V-Star. And, with that placement and my experience with Snorlax in the past, I had a lot of people requesting this list, so I decided I would just go ahead and make a deck profile on it. And so without further ado, let's get into it. So first we have the Pokemon, obviously, for Snorlax, the core to the Snorlax deck. Just prevent your opponent from retreating, use other cards to discard their switching cards, and get Pokemon into play that your opponent cannot attack with. Or use things like Handheld Fan to push the energy off of their active Pokemon so that it can still not attack, even though it technically could if they had enough energy on it. And then eventually you just run them out of resources until their active Pokemon cannot attack or be switched out of the active ever again, and then you deck them out. We have two Rotom V. Rotom V has come back into the deck. I talked about in my videos on the boxed order build of Snorlax that a big part of the reason that we play boxed orders over the Rotom V last format was for Regidrago V-Star and the threat of Alolan Exeggutor EX being able to so easily knock out our Rotom V. Now, with Regidrago significantly less popular, Rotom is a lot safer on the bench. Against decks like Gardevoir, Dragapult, and Lugia, Rotom with a Hero's Cape is relatively safe on the bench. It takes a lot of resources for our opponent to ever deal with that. And so we can use Instant Charge a lot more freely. Another factor there is that Budew, of course, is a new threat in the metagame. I don't think that Budew is a huge threat to Snorlax in general. However, if you are playing a non-Rotom based build, you can definitely struggle against Budew a little bit more if it does end up item locking you coming up into the active spot. Budew is a good thing to trap in the active anyways. You want to trap your opponent's Budew active. However, you'd still like a way to keep drawing cards so you can keep finding your Misfortune Sisters and Aries while your opponent is attacking with Budew. Next, we have two Mimikyu. So Mimikyu is good for a few matchups and be good in niche situations into decks like Lugia or Dragapult EX. Miraidon, it can be very strong against as well, but it's mostly important into Regidrago, where it cannot be knocked out without your opponent using a canceling clone, or setting up like a Mew EX, but which you can stop with Mist Energy. And Archaludon EX, which has to use their regular Duraludon to knock it out. Against Archaludon, this is a big part of your strategy. It's very easy for them to deal with Mimikyu, it's very easy for them to deal with Snorlax, and it's very easy for them to deal with Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX, which we'll talk about next. However, which I'll just pop that up on the screen here. It is very difficult for them to deal with all three. So you're sort of siphoning between all three of these strategies in order to run them out of resources until eventually they can no longer deal with one of them. Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX, another great card in the deck. I was playing two originally, but I just felt like I wasn't using it enough to justify two copies. Usually, one is plenty. Very good against Archaludon EX, like I said, but also can come up against Lugia if you manage to fill their board with Pokemon that have abilities. It can also be good against Regidrago, which can also struggle to find attackers to deal with it. Miraidon EX, sometimes you can fill their bench with Pokemon that only have abilities. But mostly this is important against Charizard EX. Charizard does not really have any good answers to Cornerstone. Sometimes they play a canceling clone, but now with Charizard being so much worse positioned into the metagame, having to deal with things like Budew and Dragapult a lot more often, Charizard's typically using its tech spots in other ways if you do play against it, and they are not usually playing that canceling clone anymore, so Cornerstone is able to wall out Charizard very, very easily. Next, we'll move on to our supporter line. This is going to be the most important part of the Snorlax deck, honestly, other than the Snorlax itself. Snorlax relies on using these powerful supporters to disrupt your opponent. We play 4 Arven. We play lots of tools in this list, so even though Arven can be a little bit weaker if your opponent goes for like a Budew play, it's still very important to get your Snorlaxes out early with Arvening for Nest Balls or Heavy Balls. Get your Rotom out. Find your Hero's Cape and your Bravery Charm to put on Rotom early on. Find your Handheld Fans when you need them. Get Forest Seal Stone in a pinch. make sure you get your flutes off early in certain matchups. So definitely still important to play the full 4 copies of Arven in a Rotom build of Snorlax. Next we have 4 Penny. So Penny is incredibly important in this matchup. There's so many decks that have Pokemon that can sort of chip and do a little bit of damage to you but can't quite knock you out. Even Badoo itself can put a decent amount of pressure on you, right? So we are wanting to Penny a lot in this metagame, especially with the Rotom and the Cornerstone in the list as well, if we want to scoop those out of play. So it's very important to play the max number of pennies. It's just such a powerful card in this metagame. Every penny sets you forward multiple turns in a lot of matchups, like against Gardevoir, that might be attacking with something like a Munkidori stuck in the active, or Dragapult, which is setting up a lot of damage on your bench Pokemon, Artazon, which is doing chip damage with their Duraludons, or even Lugia hitting you with their Archeops when that's trapped in the active spot. There's so much not quite knockouts on Snorlax happening in this metagame. Penny, very important. Plus, one of the only ways for your opponent to break the lock is usually by bossing your Rotom and not quite knocking it out because of the Hero's Cape bringing its HP up so much. So we want to be able to make sure that we can always Penny that Rotom out of the active spot immediately after it gets attacked. 2 copies of Boss's Orders. I could honestly see even going up to 3 just in case of Badoo. However, like I said, we really don't mind if our opponent has Badoo active. Usually we're pretty happy to trap it. Against Gardevoir, it can also be important to find bosses. They can self-KO their own Kirlias to put a little bit more pressure on you. That way you cannot use Counter Catcher after their first couple of attacks, since you'll be on even prizes or ahead if they have knocked out 2 Kirlias. So it can be a lot more important to find bosses, but usually as long as you play your game carefully, you play your resources carefully, 2 bosses is completely fine. Next we have 2 Misfortune Sisters. Still important to get rid of our opponent's items, find those switching cards, find stuff like rare candies against Gardevoir decks is very important, finding recovery cards against things like Gardevoir, also very important. Even just getting rid of Pal Pad and Scoop Up Cyclone against Artazon warrants playing these 2 Misfortune Sisters. It's really important that you get rid of some of those outs in that matchup. Pal Pad definitely seeing a lot more play in general, so having more ways to dig for that is very good. And even just getting rid of cards that discard cards from your opponent's hand. That way, there's a lot of Turo going around, so when they Turo put one that are trapped, if you can Misfortune Sisters away some of their ways to discard Pokemon from their hand, they might not be able to get all of their Pokemon out of their hand throughout the game, and eventually you'll be able to trap something with an Erika's Invitation. Then we have 1 Eri, another part of that supporter item discarding combo. Eri, definitely not as potent in this format. Decks like Gardevoir and Dragapult and Lugia are not that prone to Eri. Dragapult can use Recon Directive to typically, put the important items to the bottom and then, Arven them out when they're ready to find like their rare candy once they've drawn their Dusknoir and just use the rare candy right away. Eri definitely still has strength in those matchups. It's still, you can discard items that are useful to your opponent. Sometimes they Recon Directive into 2 items that they want, and they have to take one. Or you can Eri early game or after something like an Iono, where they might not have the most control over what item cards are in their hand. And of course, there are still matchups that aren't as popular where Eri is very good, like the Charizard matchup, the Miraidon matchup, even if they're playing the one of Switch cart, which a lot of lists are right now. Any Dusknoir matchup, Raging Bolt, Eri is very good against. Cloth Eri is very good against. So Eri definitely still has a lot of strength in this metagame, but it's not nearly as important. You really don't need Eri to win any of your matchups consistently. So 1 is plenty, especially because we can recycle it if we really need to. 2 copies of Cyllene. I really like Cyllene in this format for getting back our things like our Handheld Fans and our Temple of Sinnohs in certain matchups, which was very important against Gardevoir and Lugia, and Dragapult as well. Also, getting back our Mist Energy can be important. Getting back our Hero's Cape is really nice. So I really like having the 2 Cyllene in this format. Especially if we're spending time, Dragapult and Guardy both play a very, patient, so does Lugia, play a very patient game against us, where, they're waiting to draw a string of resources to use against us, so Cyllene can be a nice little way to just get some of our own resources back to prepare us for when they actually start attacking again. Team Yell's Shear, of course, essential to making sure that we don't deck out and looping. Using that usually to shuffle our Cylenes back in, then one extra supporter. Also good to be able to get Snorlax's back. Just a super powerful supporter recovery in general. And pretty much mandatory to make sure that we do not break our loop. Obviously, we can just loop Cylenes and Pal Pads. However, it's much more consistent to be able to have that Team Yell's Shear. And Team Yell's Shear is just such a powerful recovery card in this deck in general with how important supporters are to us. One Kofu, so I'd almost like another Kofu if I had the room, but it's sort of a luxury. The one Kofu definitely feels like enough. The list is already fairly consistent, but having a couple of these just random draw cards is really nice. Kofu is a great consistency card. You're always happy to play Kofu when you have it. So yeah, I just love having the one of Kofu. You can always recycle it, but it's not essential. You know, you don't necessarily need Kofu. Arven in most matchups is going to do the trick, but just having more draw cards is good, and I think that Kofu is the best draw card that you can add to the deck just because you have lots of useless cards that end up in your hand, so putting 2 cards to the bottom is usually not much of a cost. Usually happy to get rid of some extra Pokemon like Mimikyus or Cornerstones or an extra Rotom that you know you don't need, and just put those on the bottom and then just keep filling your hand up with more and more options. So I think that Kofu is just the strongest draw card in this deck right now. I played Worker in my list last format, but I don't think that there are as many important stadiums to get rid of. Worker was very synergistic with things like Enriching Energy against, Regidrago, which is usually playing Temple of Sinnoh. You get the Temple of Sinnoh out of play, or, Workering the Jamming Tower out of play. That was very common, but those don't pose as much of a threat in the current metagame to warrant the one less card drawn. Drawing more cards with Kofu is just better right now. Now, I do play 106 Machinations. Now, I'm not playing the Iono, and I know I talked about in the past that I don't love Xerosic without Iono last format, because it was mostly a tech for the mirror. However, in this format, decks Gardevoir, Lugia, and Dragapult, and Charizard all build really massive hands and are waiting to find the perfect combination of cards to put the most pressure on you as possible. As Lugia, that can be like Jet plus Mesagoza plus Iono. As Gardevoir, they can be holding out to find their Turo and just filling their hand with a ton of other options. Dragapult can be trying to build up to big Dusknoir plays on the same turn that they use their Turo or their boss. So being able to punish your opponent's patience by Xerosicking, and, usually in those situations, if your opponent has like a 19, 20 card hand, there's going to be more than 3 good cards in there. So Giacomo, essential for the Lugia matchup. I have not really used this elsewhere. I'm sure it could come up randomly against things like Cloth or Terapagos. Anything that plays Special Energy, obviously Giacomo can get some value against, but mostly this is just for Lugia. Basically, the way you use this is that you keep counter-catching up Pokemon that don't have energy on them, and using Handheld Fan to push energy onto Pokemon that don't have energy on them, and that way you can discard as many of their energy as possible at once with Giacomo. Usually this is best once your opponent is locked with Temple, otherwise they should be waiting out, but you can also punish Lugia players that aren't as patient even more so. You'd like to use Giacomo as much as you can in that matchup. Most games you are just going to be able to eventually run them out of energy, and then they bring up something that they don't have enough energy left to set up. One, Erika's Invitation. Still important to, have a way to access Pokemon in your opponent's hand, especially with the amount of Turo around. That way your opponent has to go for the Ultra Ball, Earthen Vessels to discard those Pokemon after they Turo them. Which means that you get more turns before your opponent can actually use the Turo. If they just draw the Turo, but they don't have a way to discard the Pokemon that they pick up, they might not be able to use it right away. They might have to, which gives you more turns to play things like Misfortune Sisters, Eri, Pennies, whatever you need to do. And, of course, Erika's Invitation often will be able to just find random Pokemon in your opponent's hand that they weren't able to discard, because they aren't going to be able to discard every single Pokemon that they draw every single time they draw one. Next, for the items, these are mostly going to be consistency cards that just, allow our deck to function how we want it to. We have 4 Counter Catcher, Staple, and Snorlax. Just want to be able to we're pretty much always behind, and want to be able to bring up Pokemon as many times as possible. For Pokégear, with our reliance on supporters, it's important to be able to search out the right ones at the right times. 3 Nest Ball. I'm playing a slightly lower Nest Ball count than usual. I usually like to play 4, but I'm playing a second copy of Artazon in this format, just in case you get Badooed early game. You have more ways to find your Snorlaxes. Artazon. Also, there are a lot of decks aren't playing ways to discard Artazon. Dragapult and Gardevoir, namely, are often only playing Artazon of their own as stadiums, so your Artazon can stick around longer. You can get multiple uses out of it. So yeah, only 3 Nest Ball, but of course we still need ways to search for like our Rotom and our Cornerstone when we need it. So still having to play 3 of those, but 3 has been more than enough for me. 3 Accompanying Flute. I would love to have room for 4, but 3 is enough in this format. Decks are playing so many Pokemon that one of your Flute, or even one Flute, is usually going to hit. Going a little bit earlier. However, I would love to play 4 if I could. Mostly the 3 is we only have room for the 3 here because we are trying to fit in the temples as well. We can always recover these with Cyllene as well. I don't think that 4 is necessary. 4 is way stronger in a Drago heavy format because it's super, super important card against Drago. But in this format, 3 is almost always going to do the trick. A lot of decks like Dragapult and Gardevoir usually will fill up their bench with things like Creepies, Duskulls, Gardevoir, or Ralts, Fluttermane, Klefki really early anyways, giving you less turns to use Flute regardless. Then we have 2 Night Stretcher to recover our Snorlaxes. Of course, we can recover other things as well, but mostly just to make sure that we can easily get 6 Snorlax out in a game to make our opponent have to knock out 6 Snorlax. 2 Pal Pad, allowing us to recycle our supporters. Very important to have 2 copies of these. Typically, I don't use these too recreationally. I save them for my loops. But at times when, you really need to hit a penny, you can just sort of Pal Pad 2 penny back in. Pal Pad double boss back in. Pal Pad, double Misfortune Sisters back in. Whatever you need. Very important to have access to at least one of these every game, which means we need to play 2 in case we prize it. And then, of course, 1 copy of Hisuian Heavy Ball. We don't have any other way to access our prize cards. So we always want to have access to all 4 of our Snorlaxes. Prizing double Rotom, double Mimikyu isn't really something that concerns me hugely. Prizing the 1 of Cornerstone could be annoying in some matchups, but Heavy Ball is mostly here just to make sure that we have access to all 4 Snorlax. Next, Stadium, Tools, and Energy. We have 3 Temple of Sinnoh for the Lugia matchup. With double Cyllene, this is usually enough. 3 usually is enough as is, but we can also, use Cylenes to recover some, while our opponent is waiting to draw into Mesagoza to break the Temple of Sinnoh lock, to use their Jet Energy. We usually have time to, go ahead and Cyllene more Temple of Sinnohs back in. So yeah, just playing the 3 of these. It's not super important in really any other matchup. A lot of the time what I'll do is, once I'm all set up and I know I don't need Artazon anymore, I'll just start playing Temple of Sinnoh, Artazon, Temple of Sinnoh, Artazon every other turn until I work through all my stadiums, just so that they don't go back into my deck if my opponent uses something like a Judge or an Iono, just because I want to thin them from the deck. But a lot of time you do want to prioritize keeping the Artazon in play if you're not playing against Lugia. Then, of course, we have the 2 copies of Artazon, just ways to search for Snorlax, especially under Badoo lock. Like I mentioned earlier, I already sort of talked about this when we were talking about Nest Ball, so I won't over-explain the double copy of Artazon there. Now, 3 Handheld Fan. Handheld Fan is incredibly important in most of our important matchups right now. It's insanely good against Gardevoir. You can move the energy off of Munkidori. When it's attacking you, you can push a bunch of their energy onto Pokemon that are already set up to attack and eventually run them out of Psychic Energy. If they try to Teleportation Burst with a Ralts, you can push that energy off and then just bring the Ralts back up. Against Archaludon EX, they a lot of time want to attack you with regular Duraludon, because if they evolve, then they can get walled out by Mimikyu and Cornerstone. So Handheld Fan can push their energy back onto their bench Pokemon. Or if you're walling them out with the Cornerstone and they're attacking you for 80 damage with Duraludon, you can Handheld Fan their metals onto bench Pokemon that cannot attack your Cornerstone. Against Dragapult, they only pay 3 Fire and 3 Psychic. So especially if you can trap something like an Alakazam, you can just sort of run them out of one of their energy types, so they can no longer attack with their active Pokemon. Honestly, Handheld Fan has use in pretty much any matchup against any deck that attacks, but that is the reason that we are playing so many right now, is because it is good against Gardevoir and Dragapult Archuludon and Lugia, which are the four most popular decks. And against Lugia, if they're attacking it with Archeops, especially late game when they've run out of ways to break Temple Lock, and so they can no longer use Jet Energy, usually they have to attack with Archeops, so we can just sort of push the Handheld Fans off, and by making them spread their energy around their Pokemon with Handheld Fan, we can discard more energy when we use Giacomo. One Bravery Charm, just to get that Snorlax up to the 200 mark, gets around, means that it can't be one-shot by things like Miracle Force. A Teal Mask needs more energy to knock it out. Dragapult cannot knock out our Rotom if it has a Bravery Charm on it. Same with Lugia V-Star knocking out Rotom. A lot of things, Miracle Force can't knock out Rotom either, so Bravery Charm going to usually be going on Rotom if our Hero's Cape is prized, but even if it's not prized, sometimes there are matchups where the Hero's Cape is more important on the Snorlax, so we'll just Bravery Charm the Rotom. Or we'll just already have the Bravery Charm Rotom in hand, so that's what we'll do. Just gives us more ways to keep the Rotom alive, and of course is also useful on Snorlax if we don't use it on the Rotom. Next we have the Hero's Cape. So Hero's Cape does great things for math. Really difficult for most decks to knock out a 290 HP Rotom. It's just a little bit too much for most decks to get there. And then 250 HP Snorlax is out of range of a lot of things that a Bravery Charm Snorlax isn't as well, like the 220 from Archuludon, Gardevoir EX with 1 Adrenabrain, Miraidon EX attack. So Hero's Cape, really good on either the Snorlax or the Rotom. Usually it's going to go on the Rotom, and then we'll penny up the Rotom later and recommit the Hero's Cape to one of our Snorlax. Also forces Archeops to 3-shot a Snorlax, so that is a really good use of the Hero's Cape as well. 1 Forest Seal Stone. Since we're playing 2 Rotom, it just makes sense to have, and 4 Arven, just makes sense to have 1 Forest Seal Stone so that we have access to a V-Star power. We'll use this most games, just to go ahead and search for a card at some point. We can always penny the Rotom after if it's a risk, or if we open Rotom, that can be a really good way to use Stone, as we, Arven for the Stone, Star Alchemy for something, and then penny the Rotom into a Snorlax on our following turn. Usually it would be Arven for Stone, pass, use the Stone, find something, and then penny. Mist Energy. So Mist Energy has a few different uses in this deck. It's good to have a pivot for your Mimikyus, your Cornerstones, and your Rotom. A lot of time we'll just Stone for the Mist to make sure to get our Rotom out of the active position quickly, because we want to get Snorlax into the active as soon as possible most of the time. But Mist Energy also gives us some play into Roaring Moon EX. Of course, it prevents Frenzied Gouging onto Mimikyu. It's very niche because they do play a way to knock out Mimikyu, but there are certain games where, maybe they Pokestop away their baby Roaring Moon, and then you can Eri and Night Stretcher away their... Eri and Miss Fortune Zerster away their Night Stretcher and Mist Energy or Mimikyu, and win against a deck that you otherwise pretty much auto-lose to. Mist Energy on Mimikyu also protects it from genome hacking, copying Ghost Eye on Mew EX against both Miraidon and Regidrago, which is especially important in the Regidrago matchup. And of course, Dragapult EX is very, very good right now, so even just stopping Phantom Dive damage on one of your Snorlaxes can be very, very important in some situations, or stopping Phantom Dive damage on your Rotom. A lot of the time, if we draw the Mist Energy and we don't have any other use for it in that matchup, we'll just go ahead and put it on the Rotom. That way, if it does get bossed up, we don't need if we get like Iono'd later, the Mist Energy goes to the bottom and then they boss up the Rotom, then we might not have the way to get the Rotom into the active. But if we put the Mist Energy on it as soon as we draw it, then if they ever boss it, then we know that it already is going to have a way to retreat immediately. All right, now that we've talked about the list, let's get into our matchups. Mostly favorable matchups for Snorlax in this format, which is why it is so good right now. Let's start with the favorable matchups. We have Gardevoir. Now, I think this is favorable based on my own testing and the way that most people are building their Gardevoir lists, but if they are playing... This is very list dependent. If they are playing Double Turo and Pal Pad, that can be really tricky. That's access to a lot of Turos if they manage to get use out of their Pal Pad. If they're playing Spiritomb, things can get a lot more difficult. So, but I think most lists, Snorlax is very good against. And even some of the lists that play Pal Pad or Spiritomb and Double Turo are still fine. Basically... The rundown is you are slightly favored into lists that play 2 Turo and a Tomb, which is becoming increasingly common, so you have a slight edge into that build. But if they have 2 Turo and a Tomb and a Pal Pad, you are definitely unfavored. If they have 2 Turo and a Pal Pad but no Spiritomb, it's about even. And if they have anything less than that, if they only have 1 Turo and a Pal Pad and a Spiritomb, or they only have 1 Turo and a Spiritomb, no Pal Pad, or if they have 2 Turo but no Pal Pad and no Spiritomb, all of those matchups are like significantly favorable for you. So overall, the matchup is favorable, but it definitely depends on your opponent's specific list composition. And I have not seen a lot of people playing. I play Pal Pad in my Gardevoir list. I have not seen most people playing Pal Pad. And as long as they're not playing Pal Pad, I think you are favored, even if only slightly against lists with 2 Turo and Spiritomb. Dragapult Dusknoir, definitely favorable. They usually only play 1 Turo. I've seen some lists playing Thornton, but usually it's over the Turo, so it ends up the same. They just have a lot of Pokemon that you can trap, and you can also just run them out of Psychics with Handheld Fans. So yeah, Dragapult Dusknoir, definitely favorable. You have to sort of target down those rare candies to limit their Dusknoir usage, but even if they get use of all their Dusknoirs, it definitely is still a favorable matchup. Lugia V-Star, another favorable matchup. Like we talked about earlier, your sort of general game plan is to keep counter-catching up Pokemon that don't have energy on them, spam your Temple of Sinnohs, and then, use Giacomo to discard energy from all of their Pokemon at once. Of course, usually early on, you're just going to counter-catcher up Pokemon for energy on them, because that's going to expend the most energy out of their deck to set up, especially with Temple shutting down DTE. As you get into the mid to late game, you're definitely bringing out those Archeops, making sure that they can't hit into it. A lot of games, Lugia plays a lot of basics, and they want to hold out for like an optimal setup to use Summoning Star. They don't really want to set up for Summoning Star for 1 Archeops or they don't have, they can't use Lumineon to get their Summoning Star out because they don't really want to bench Lumineon against Snorlax, and they don't want to discard too many energy with researches while trying to find their Archeops out. So sometimes they can be slower against Snorlax to actually get Summoning Star off than against most decks, which gives you more time to use Flutes, and with all their basic Pokemon, sometimes you can just fill their bench with Pokemon that all can't deal with Mimikyu, or Pokemon that all can't deal with Cornerstone, or just all Pokemon that aren't Archeops in general, and that is a lot of the time going to be enough to win the game. If you can get Blood Moon or Iron Hands on the board, then honestly, even that alone is usually enough to win the game. Against Charizard, this matchup is definitely another one that is quite favorable. They're very reliant on using multiple Dusknoirs against you. They don't have really good ways to deal with Mimikyu or Cornerstone, so you just sort of throw those at them. They also don't have that many Snorlax outs. You can win with just the Snorlax line, but the Mimikyu and Cornerstone line is going to be more consistent. And then you're just sort of using Eri and Misfortune Sisters to try to get rid of their Dusknoir pieces, their Super Odds, their Rare Candies, their Night Stretcher. Miraidon, this is a matchup where you can win with Mimikyu. Most lists are playing Zapdos now, so usually we're just trying to go with Snorlax. You just want to keep counter-catching up Pokemon that don't have energy on them, and usually they will eventually run out of energy. They do have enough Pokemon to power up a full board of Pokemon with energy, but by then they're usually, you can prevent them from taking many prizes at all up to that point. And so by then they usually don't have enough cards in deck to actually take all of their prize cards. Iron Hands cannot even one-shot a Snorlax with a Bravery Charm, so that is like an easy thing to trap for sure. And if they don't see a bench spot for Zapdos, or then you can go ahead and Mimikyu lock them. Sometimes you can fill their bench with only Pokemon that have abilities, and a lot of the time you'll be able to find a Pokemon off of Flute that cannot retreat anyways. They only play 1 switch card, so as soon as you Flute something like a Latias EX, or a Squawkabilly EX, or a Lumineon into play, you've really already won. Cirilla GX, another matchup where you have multiple options, especially with Temple of Sinnoh. This matchup is very free. They have a lot of Pokemon that you can trap with Flutes, and they don't have a lot of ways to deal with Mimikyu, so Mimikyu can be really good early game if you don't have anything that you can trap down yet, but usually you'll be able to find something off of Flute that you can trap pretty quickly, and then you can Temple of Sinnoh through their Jet Energies. Usually that's their only way of switching around. So you can just trap something with Snorlax. Raging Bolt EX, another deck that you can sort of just wall out with Mimikyu. They have Slitherwing that can deal with Mimikyu, but you can Heroes Cape it so that they don't quite one-shot it. And then, they'll knock out their own Slitherwing. You can Eri and Fortune System their Night Stretcher so they can't get the Slitherwing back. Or you can just win by fluting a Pokemon into play that can't attack and just Snorlaxing it. That's also going to be a very easy winning line against Raging Bolt. They play a lot of basics that can't attack. And even if all of the Pokemon on board can attack, if they have like 3 of them are like Teal Mask, they don't play enough Grass Energy to power up older Teal Mask, you can counter catcher up one, they set it up, they attack with it, you bring up another, they set it up, they attack with it, you bring up another, they don't have enough energy to power it up anymore. They usually play 2 switch cards, sometimes only 1 now though, because they're usually playing the Lottie SCX now with Bedouin format. Dragapult Iron Thorns, another real matchup. They usually play 1 Turo. Some of us might be going up to 2 now, but they play a lot of Pokemon that you can trap, and they play pretty thin counts of all their energy. Iron Thorns EX doesn't even one-shot a Snorlax, so you can just sort of handheld fan all of their lightning energy onto their Dragapults, and then trap Iron Thorns for the rest of the game. Dragapult Charizard, similar to the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup, except they don't have the Dusknoir option, so it's even easier. There's lots of things that you can trap. You're trying to get something in the active spot, lock it there. Without Dusknoir, they don't have as many ways to take cheeky prize cards on you, so usually you just win the game a lot more convincingly than you do against Dragapult Dusknoir. Our even matchups, we have Archaludon EX. So this has been a traditionally unfavored matchup. I think that I've sort of solved the matchup to be even. I've been beating it more often than not on high ELO ladder. I'm about 1800. And I've been hitting a lot of great Archaludon players. And if you sort of go between Mimikyu, Cornerstone, and Snorlax, it's very tough for them to deal with all of them. As soon as you start fluting Pokemon under their board, you're in a pretty good spot. I optimally don't usually even evolve into their Archaludon EX, because then you just go ahead and Cornerstone or Mimikyu lock them, and they have to retreat it, and then you just keep bringing it back up, and they keep having to retreat it, and eventually they won't have enough energy to keep retreating it. They can attack with a Duraludon into your Cornerstone, but you can just sort of penny it, and counter catch their Archaludon EX back up. And of course, if they're just attacking with Duraludons into your Snorlax's early game because they are too scared to evolve into Archaludon EX, then they're not one-shotting you, which means handheld fan Snorlax can put a lot of work onto their regular Duraludons. So this is a very difficult matchup to play. I don't know if I can really summarize it in just this video. They might need a whole video on its own of how to consistently beat Archaludon EX with the deck. Obviously, it's still a close matchup. Like I said, it's even, so even if you perfect the strategy, you're still not going to be beating Archaludon EX every time. But hopefully, my explanations of sort of how to weave between Cornerstone, Mimikyu, and Lax help you win that matchup to some degree. If you want some one-on-one time with the in the matchup and to really grind it out, I am always available on Metafy. Regidrago, a matchup that is slightly better than it was last format. However, our list isn't built to beat it as consistently as the box order list was last format. My list last format for Snorlax was built specifically with beating Regidrago V-Star as often as possible in mind, which made the matchup slightly favorable for Snorlax. Now it's about even because their list usually is not quite as equipped to deal with ours. However, our list is not as equipped to deal with Regidrago either. Usually they're not playing Alone Executory EX anymore, which is a great buff, but if they are, that still makes things difficult. Usually they're playing Lottie EX instead of Switch, but now sometimes they also have things like Turo, which can be a problem in and of itself, if not a bigger problem than a Switch. So your game plan is relatively the same as it was last format. If you want to hear about sort of a lot of my games against it, and how they went at Toronto Regionals, I do talk about that a lot. I played against a lot of Regidrago at Toronto, I think 5. So in my tournament report video. But the summation of it is you're trying to get Pokemon that can't attack onto the bench with Awakening Flute or Accompanying Flutes, and then use Misfortune Sisters and Eri to target their switching cards. And then their optimal line is to wait until they've used all their switching cards to use Legacy Star so that they don't accidentally discard an extra switching card, and then use one to attack and use Iono to put the other one to the bottom, and then you have to try to hit Misfortune Sisters to discard that last switching card. And that's if they set up optimally. If you never Misfortune Sister or Eri a switching card away before that point, and they are able to get a prize before you're able to trap something. So it's very close. You have to, it depends a lot on how both players draw. Mimikyu Mist is another option that we have to win the matchup now if we can get rid of their clone and they've already used their Legacy Star. Their only way to deal with Mimikyu Mist is Radiant Charizard. It wasn't really as much of an option last format because they usually had Temple of Sinnoh plus Alolan Exeggutor X, which are both problems for the Mimikyu Mist combo. However, a lot of lists aren't playing Temple right now, and most lists are not playing the Alolan Exeggutor X, so it gives us a couple more ways to use the Mimikyu against the Drago players. Now, our unfavorable matchups. First, we have Cloth. My list last format, I played 2 Klefki to beat Cloth consistently. However, in this format, I don't think Cloth is going to be nearly as popular, so I just decided not to tech for it. I'd rather be able to beat Gardevoir, Dragapult, and Lugia, which take up a lot of deck space on their own. You know, we have to play multiple Handheld Fans, we have to play Temple of Sinnohs. That takes up a lot of room in our deck, so we don't really have room to also tech for these less popular decks like Cloth. And so Cloth, of course, has the Petron TX that can perpetually bring its Dark Pokemon up into the active spot, which means that we cannot truly trap them if they get the Petron TX and the regular Petron up onto the board. They can just do 80 damage poison to us forever, which is very difficult for us to keep pace with. Your main game plan against this deck is still going to be to use as many flutes as possible early game and try to fill their bench with Pokemon that are not Petron TX. That way you can lock them out of that option. Next we have Ancient Box. Also unfavorable. Now, this matchup is completely fine, and you can just trap something like Koraidon or Greninja if they don't play Petron TX. If they do play Petron TX, your only win condition is to flute enough Pokemon to play that they cannot bench it. If they get Petron TX into play, you really have no win condition against Ancient Box currently. You can try to use Handheld Fan to push all of their energy to the bench, but if they play optimally, 7 Dark Energy on 1 Roaring Moon should be more than enough for them to take all of their prize cards. But that's it. I think this deck is one of the best positioned decks in the format right now. I'm between this and Gardevoir for my upcoming events. Currently, I would probably be playing Gardevoir to my local League Cups and challenges and stuff just because the players will appreciate that a little bit more than playing Snorlax. However, Snorlax is what I have been grinding on the PCG Live ladder. That is how I have gotten... I mean, I've been playing a lot of everything on ladder, but the deck that has gotten, I've had the highest win percentage with on ladder, the one that has truly gotten me up to the 1800 mark is this Snorlax list. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a great play for EUIC, so I hope some people can give it the respect that it deserves at that event. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.